Jonathon Choe is back talking about his latest investigation titled Exclusive Seattle's Homeless Housing Horrors Exposed, now demonetized on YouTube. We're going to have to talk about that. Jonathon, let me play this quick clip. Can you set the scene for us? What are we about to see here?
Well, I did a year-long investigation into some of Seattle's homeless housing facilities. And the first part in my multi-part series is a piece on Plymouth Housing's Lewiston Scargo in Seattle's Belltown neighborhood. It's downtown Seattle, essentially. And basically what's happening in this story is that I'm being led by We Heart Seattle's Andrea Suarez. She's helping out one of her clients. Her clients begged her to come by because the conditions have been so bad. And this is what you call low barrier housing. In other words, they allow drug use here without any requirements for intervention or to get help. And that's what's causing this cycle where people aren't just dying of fentanyl overdoses on the streets, they're also dying behind closed doors.
Okay, let's watch this quick clip.
All right, when we got out of that.
Andrea, what is that?
Well, I would say that is probably somebody that went through withdrawal and cracked right here in the hallway.
Matzik reached out to Suarez for help, saying the conditions inside the building were becoming unbearable.
You got rats in here?
Yeah, rats underneath there, crawls underneath, and a whole bunch of them under there.
He's been forced to move rooms several times and says he's feeling hopeless.
Okay, so you can't even lock the door when you leave?
No, I can't.
Why don't you go to management and ask for a new key?
They don't have a key for that lock right there.
Oh my gosh.
Is anybody ever using this phone since the 80s?
Matzik recently invited us over as he smoked fentanyl with his friends.
Oh my gosh.
Whoa. Mike, who's in your room?
Drug use inside the rooms are a regular occurrence.
And this unit is a trap house. This is a garbage can full of foil, drugs, revolving door.
So does the staff here at Plymouth Housing, do they let you guys do drugs in here?
They don't say no, but they don't,
It's legal. This is a harm reduction place.
This is harm reduction?
Yeah, so they provide the paraphernalia like that.
I'm going to start there just because I wanted to ask you first about this idea of harm reduction and whether this series that you're doing, I guess if this is a counter perspective to the way that either the government or the local news is covering this particular issue. Like, in other words, are you trying to show a different perspective, or has this become part of the discussion at this point among the movers and shakers in Seattle?
I mean, I think that's a great observation, Allison. I think it's all of the above. For so long, mainstream media has only put the voices on who say homelessness is an affordable housing crisis, and if we only build more housing, we can solve this. The problem with the strategy, which is called Housing First, which is actually a federal policy, it's been tried for 10 years now, and it's still not working. So, hey, I'm in the camp where if something's working, let's double down, let's triple down. But the problem, it's not. So what we're trying to do is showing what the raw realities are on the ground. And what's really happening is that Housing First, where you just shove somebody behind a closed door and hope they get better, and also this harm reduction strategy where they give away meth pipes, fentanyl foil, needles to do their drugs without any requirements for treatment, I'm showing it's not working. So I believe this is reality versus maybe what some may feel is, I don't know, propaganda, a counter narrative, but this is really what's happening in downtown Seattle. And I think a lot of the new elected officials, for example, on the Seattle City Council, they're starting to wake up. They're starting to see that the current plan is not working.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't lived in Seattle now for a few years, and we left Washington State last summer. So I don't know how the ambiance has changed around this particular issue. I know back when I was a TV reporter in Seattle, it was very touchy. I was an environmental reporter, and there was an obvious problem with environmental issues related to people living out on the streets, and especially near the water. But I knew the environmental groups were very nervous to talk about it because they were going to then catch the ire of their cohorts because they all kind of ran in the same political circles. And so they didn't want to confront that issue because it was so touchy. Is it still so touchy, or I mean, what kind of response are you getting to this? Are you able to do a report like this and have people see it as fair journalism, or are you still, are people still like either very nervous to talk to you about it, and or do you get a lot of anger and reaction from people in Seattle?
I mean, we'll have to unpack all those questions because it's more than one question, but fair questions. Yeah, since you left just a few years ago, Allison, things really haven't changed in terms of the crisis on the streets. Again, I want to emphasize this is not just a lack of affordable housing that's causing homelessness on the streets. I believe in the research we're doing at Discovery Institute is clearly showing that the root causes of homelessness are drug addiction, mental illness, and broken relationships. And for so long, again, there's only been one narrative pushed by these activist groups that have been pushing harm reduction and housing first. And like I said, if it was working, I would say let's proceed, but it's not. And finally, because of our reporting, a lot of the independent journalists now focused on this homelessness beat, those walls are being torn down, whether they like it or not. We're holding the system accountable because this is really what's happening. And again, I'm encouraged here in Seattle that the tide is turning, because this new council that is no longer just full of activists, they're starting to look at the actual data. They're asking for accountability. They're asking for metrics. They're asking for results. And again, the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, this entity that was supposed to help solve homelessness in downtown within a year, after a $10 million infusion of private funding from groups like Microsoft, Alaska Airlines, and a whole bunch of corporations, that group has now lost even more funding. The city recently, the city of Seattle, pulled almost $11 million, saying, "Hey, we're going to go it alone and focus on the outreach ourselves because the current plan again is not working." And I think these activists that you were talking about, and you're spot on, Allison. Again, I call them the far left. They happen to swim in the same circles of harm reduction, environmentalism, as well as the housing first agenda.
Mm-hmm. It always was just really interesting, the political pressure to stay quiet in a place like Seattle if you had something that was worth saying, but there are just so many people who are too scared to say it. And then that gives the population there, just your average resident, but also I think the people in power, a false assumption that everybody just agrees with them when it's really not true. There actually is, I think, some diversity of thought in Seattle, but a lot of people are just too scared to speak up. Let me tell people real fast about a great glass of wine so that Jonathan can take a quick break for a second and think about this next question, Jonathan. My next question for you is going to be about, I saw towards the end, a guy says, it's almost worse, or it's worse, something like it's almost worse than the situation out on the street. And I want you to tell me why someone would argue against that. Like from what we just saw, what is the opposition to someone saying that? What are they saying? Why are they saying it's better? I guess maybe that's the better way to ask the question. Why would someone look at this, and what's their argument? Steelman, for me, your argument. What's their argument for this when they watch something like this? They just think that it's you're just picking something that's not representative of the entire whole. They think it is better than at least they're not getting rained on. It's not cold outside. Give me the counterpoint to this. Okay. So think on that for a second. Don't forget, everybody, if you want to support my work and you like wine, you're already a wine drinker, AllisonWinePromo.com is where you can get your extremist altitude wines. These are wines you cannot get at the grocery store. You almost can't get them in the United States. They are part of the Bonner Wine Collection, and they have been so good to me since I got on to the YouTube/independent media world. They've never told me who I can talk to, what I can ask, what I can say, anything like that. And it's just really good wine. You have gotten into an argument about Seattle's housing or homelessness with somebody on Facebook. It was your grandma. You used to have a great relationship with her, and now she hates you. get grandma a great glass of wine and maybe she'll forget all about it. Okay. AllisonWinePromo.com. You get 50% off my wines and 50% off shipping. These come from 6,000 to 9,000 feet from very remote regions of Argentina. The grapes are working very hard for you and will work very hard to get grandma back in your good graces. Okay. So Jonathan, back to my question is, when we watch something, it seems like obvious to a lot of us, we watch your investigation and we're thinking, yeah, like that guy said, it does seem like you may have a roof over your head, but it's basically the same conditions, maybe even worse because you're all crammed together instead of being able to like get out on the street and have a little space. But I'm sure there are obviously enough people who look at that and probably don't even find any shock or horror in it. You know, they look at your title and they think you're just trying to get people worked up. Put yourself in their shoes and give us their argument.
I mean, are you talking about the people who may be watching this piece and saying it's not true?
No, not saying it's not true, but look at it and still think this is a good idea. What's their reason? Is it because at least they're not out in 35-degree weather and rain? I mean, why did they think this is better than the streets?
I don't know. You're going to have to ask them. Okay. But when I've interviewed them, when I've talked to the people at the Housing First lobby, look, they're just trying to build out housing, and they believe that putting people indoors is better than living outside. Like you said, that's simply their argument. And they believe that they're going to get quote unquote wraparound services for the homeless once they get indoors. But the problem with that statement is that it's disingenuous. If you talk about permanent supportive housing, according to state law, it has to be low barrier. In other words, no one is required to get treatment, and they allow drug use in these facilities, and they give away all the drug paraphernalia like meth pipes, needles, and the fentanyl foil, so you don't overdose and die. But the problem is people are still dying indoors, and that's why that man who I interviewed, who lives at the Lewiston Scargo, who is under Plymouth housing, said it's better to be outdoors where at least I don't have to live with the rats and cockroaches. And on top of that, what he was essentially saying was that he had more freedom outside. There are rules that he has to follow indoors, and at the same time, he doesn't have the freedom, again, or the space to do what he wants to do. So look, overall, somebody hearing what I'm saying in my report, they may be saying, wow, this is unbelievable. I can't believe there are people out there like this. But that's exactly the point of why I'm covering this beat, this homeless beat, because there is no one size fits all, Allison, as you know. It is a wide spectrum. Homelessness involves maybe the single mom who just lost her job and her rent went up $200. You know what? She needs a bridge. She needs a place to stand until she can get back on her feet. I'm all for helping people like that. But on the other spectrum, you've got what I call a nomad class. These are the folks who have now totally given up on society. They don't want a job anymore. They don't want to pay their taxes. They don't want to live by any rules. So what they've done is they found places in the city of Seattle, for example, the Soto neighborhood near the stadiums. You remember that area, Allison. Yeah. The reason why it's so ideal for the homeless and for folks living in RVs is that it's also near the methadone clinics. It's near 2 food banks. It's near shelters. It's near churches that come by and hand out free food. I call that enabling. And that's the problem, and that's the distinction I believe we need to make. And then in between the spectrum, you've got folks, again, who are all over the place. And again, I'm going to say this is not just an affordable housing crisis. You got to deal with the drug addiction, mental illness, and again, their broken relationships. Recently, there was a guy building a cabin in Jose Rizal Park in Seattle, and his mom saw the footage online and said, I want him back home. Meanwhile, this guy's telling us that he's homeless, he's down and out, and no one wants to help him. So in other words, he has a place to go, but they're choosing this lifestyle, Allison.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that the advocates of it are disingenuous about when they discuss it. They want it to sound like none of these people choose it when actually they do. There are a lot of people that do. One of the things that I also think is really nuts about Seattle are the rules, how they're so arbitrary depending on how the city defines you. So for instance, my old friend who lived in the University District where I used to live, she couldn't go on vacation for longer than 4 or 5 days or something and leave her car parked on the street, even though she paid registration for a year of parking in Seattle, because they considered it then an abandoned vehicle. You can't park your car. I mean, she didn't have a driveway in her rental unit, so everybody parked on the street, which is fine for a few days, but you can't go on vacation for longer than a few days. At least this was a rule then. So she can't park there for days at a time, even though she pays for a parking permit. But if you're somebody who is totally out of the system and you're in one of those areas like you mentioned where you can have an RV or a car just parked wherever and everybody just leaves you alone, you're paying nothing into the system. I mean, I don't know. Those just make it free for everybody to just park their car forever if you're going to do it. It just doesn't seem like it's fair. Like you try to follow the rules in Seattle, you end up getting dinged for it. It doesn't incentivize citizenry, I guess, in the city of Seattle when you end up getting punished for following the rules. And and then if you just decide you're going to live outside the system, you actually benefit quite a bit from at least getting left alone. I don't know what you think about that, but that was just something that I noticed about the area.
No, nothing has changed. I mean, that's one of the greatest gripes around here. It's that there are two classes of systems: one for law-abiding citizens, and another system for criminals, for people who just want to live in a lawless way. And that's probably one of the most frustrating pieces for the reasonable people of Seattle, the reasonable residents in this city, and also for the most of the lawmakers here now in Seattle. They're sick of this as well. But people are starting to realize that the tide is turning. There's a new city council, as I've mentioned. I know several council members who are now quietly and strategically reassessing how we got to this point, identifying what the problem is, and then finding new solutions. Because, Allison, we truly do need new solutions in the city if we want to move forward. You can't allow the status quo. And for so long, it's been allowed to get to this point. So it's going to take years, no doubt. Do I believe we're heading in the right direction? Yes. But it's going to take years to really change the culture of the city, because so much of it is embedded here. And what I like to call the homeless industrial complex. You have, so many nonprofits, CEOs making $300,000 a year. They don't have an incentive to solve this homeless crisis, because if they do, they're out of jobs. And that's what I believe. And the nonprofits closed down and shut down. So there's so many different tentacles involved in this situation right now that it's really going to have to take at least just this entire city to just wake up and say enough is enough.
Whatever happened to Como's Seattle is Dying series? Did that ever make it to anything, like changing anything? Or, I mean, how you obviously are doing this outside of the mainstream news. Did Como just quit that series? Did any of the news organizations follow suit?
Well, Allison, as you know better than anybody, the state of American journalism is in flux. And what's happening now, since that documentary came out roughly, nearly 4 years ago, I mean, it made a splash. Seattle is Dying has millions of views on YouTube, and it showed the problem and also talked about the solutions. But it takes a lot of political will and culture change for all of that to happen. And since then, veteran reporters have left Como. I obviously parted ways with Como, and now I'm starting to see where if we're going to make a difference with our work, it's going to have to be through independent journalism. It's going to have to be through different social media platforms. And if you look at all the data now, fewer people are reading newspapers, fewer people are watching local TV news, and they're getting most of their news off their tablets or social media platforms. And it's really the rise of personality. So I've been able to break through that. I know you have as well. And I'm really just now focused on this homeless beat. So in many ways, again, I have no animosity, ill will towards Como News. For your audience doesn't know, Google me. I got fired from Como News for allegedly promoting the Proud Boys, but that's in my past now, because now I'm focused on video first journalism. And as you know, you're a TV person, that's your background. The video don't lie. And no one can argue with the video, the devastating video that we're showing. So I'm going to continue to do that. And at the end of the day, it's the best way to hold our public officials accountable. Because when we're not covering this stuff, Allison, the public officials, electeds, can say, oh, everything's fine, our policies are working. But now they can't ignore the problem that people are seeing every single day in the millions.
Mm-hmm. I do. I think it's really interesting, the rise of, especially, for instance, like a nonprofit, like the organization you're working with, deciding it wants to get into the world of journalism, and the opportunities that we can have outside of the big box brand newsrooms, which I tell people all the time, even if the intentions are pure, which they're not a lot, like even if there isn't bias or there isn't corruption, there still isn't time. There just isn't time a lot to do journalism. And even if you have a reporter who really does want to get to the bottom of something, they rarely have the resources to do it. Though the newsrooms will rarely ever admit that the journalism suffers because of that, and journalists refuse to believe that their journalism suffers. They'll be the first ones to complain when they go out, to bars or whatever with each other. But then if the public says fake news and they're like, no, we're not fake news, it's great, even though they'll complain constantly about not being able to do their job. Don't forget, everybody, if you are not a credit card person, you want to support my work, you can send me a letter, send me a note of encouragement, send me a winning lottery ticket. Winning lottery tickets only, please. Send me your pocket lint, I guess. Nothing really creepy. Picture of your family, great. Picture of other weird things, not great. Don't send me anything edible. I'm not going to eat it. I'm going to assume you're trying to kill me. And anything else? I really appreciate everybody sent me mail. P.O. Box 3355, Denellen, Florida 34432. Also, one of the best ways is to join my editorial board at AllisonMorrow.locals.com. You get to put in questions ahead of time for interviews, like with Jonathan, and be on my editorial board. So let's go take one right now. Well, this is more of a comment. Stoop Dog, it seems to me the oligarchs want homelessness to keep the paycheck to paycheck majority of us in line. Junk Silver, I've heard it said that any bureaucracy is ultimately going to make its own existence and growth its main focus. Is that what's happening here? Are these mentally ill drug addicts nothing more than meal tickets for the harm reduction task forces and their vendors? Also, I didn't observe any harm being reduced in that video clip. Did I miss something? You kind of mentioned this idea that's just keep the train going.
Yeah, sadly, Allison, you and I are journalists, longtime journalists, so we're skeptical, we're cynics, and I'm sorry, based on what I've seen. I mean, are there groups out there like Union Gospel Mission, Salvation Army, really trying to make a difference? Are there other nonprofits like The More We Love and We Heart Seattle here, doing, boots on the ground outreach? Yes, and they're making a difference and they're saving lives. But there are also other entities out there, again, that your viewers, your followers have clearly picked up on, and that's the homeless industrial complex. It's the cluster of nonprofits that have just sprouted up, and they're trying to keep this song going as long as possible. They don't want to solve homelessness. I won't name the politician because it's one of my sources here in Seattle told me that there's a state lawmaker who's really been behind pushing a lot of this homeless housing in King County and in Seattle. And when my source asked, hey, why don't we find a solution, a way to help people own their housing instead of just renting? This lawmaker said, no, that would defeat the purpose then. In other words, they're benefiting. There are so many people benefiting from this. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I'm sorry, but there are people who only care about the bottom line instead of people's lives.